In the course of a program, you may have some variables. Here I've got an int called num1, one called num2, and another called num3. When you create these variables, when you say int, the machine finds space in memory big enough to hold an int anywhere in memory. And in this case, it puts a 4 in there. It does something else. It puts the address of where this variable can be found into a table. Then later on, if you want to print out the value of num1, the computer goes to that table, finds the address, goes to that address, grabs the value there, and prints it out. The same for these. You say int num2, it hunts in memory, finds a spot. It doesn't have to be anywhere near num1, just finds a spot that's big enough to hold an int, makes note of where that spot is because it has to find it in the future, so keeps that address in a table, and in this case puts a 5 in there. And then it does the same thing for num3. Finds some spot, and it doesn't matter where, and puts a number in there. Keeps note of where it's put num3. And then when you want to print num3, system.out.println num3, it goes to the table, finds out where it put num3, goes and finds it, and gets the value. And this is what happens when these are single variables, and these single variables can hold one value each. An array is a data structure. And what we mean by data structure is it is a structure that can hold data. And here I have a picture of one that I've called A. It can hold 3 ints, and we're going to put some ints in there. We're going to put these same numbers that we had here, 4, 5, and 1. But now, because it's an array, the machine has to keep these numbers one after the other in memory. It can't have them all over the place as it did over to the right here. It has to have them coming one after the other, and we call this contiguous. So when we declare our array, we declare it with the word new. We signal that it's an array by putting these square brackets, which incidentally come either before or after the name A. Usually I put them before. And we have to tell it how much space to keep. So here we are telling the computer we want an array of ints. We want to keep 3 of them. So you have to find a place in memory big enough to hold 3 ints, not just one. Over here we're telling it find a place in memory to hold 1 int. Now we're saying find a place big enough to hold 3 of them, one after the other. With an array, these things in the array, these kind of cells, these are called elements. And these elements have numbers. So this one is element 0, this is element 1, and this is element 2. In computer science, we always start at 0. So these are indices. I'll just write here index. The singular is index, the plural is indices. So this 4 is located at A0. This 5 is located at A1, and the 1 is located at A2. How do we say that? This is how we say give us an array or make space to hold 3 ints. Now if I want to put those numbers in there, I say A0 equals 4, and that puts that 4 in at index 0, meaning here. A1 equals 5, so that puts the 5 in at index 1, and A2 is 1. So that puts that 1 in at index 2. Why do these have to be contiguous? We said here, when we declare our array, we're saying A is going to be an int array. A is an array of ints. There are going to be 3, at most 3. We don't actually have to put anything in the array, but if I do, I'm going to have at most 3 ints. So keep space for 3 of them. You remember over here we talked about addresses. We said that num1 has an address, num2 has an address, num3 has an address. With arrays, the only thing that has the address is the array itself, the beginning of the array. So the machine just keeps the address of the first element. So it's keeping the address of the first element. If I want to print out A2, it goes to the first element and then it hops over 2 to find this. And that's why they have to be contiguous, because it's only keeping the address of the first one, and then in order to get the others, it moves along that many elements. It's not always easy to see a loop, but what is easy is to see what you are doing over and over again. Well, let's suppose we wanted to print out the values in this array. I can say system.out.println. Now what would I put in here? For the first one, I would say A0. So this top line, this prints out the A0. A0 is 4. Print line A1, A1 is 5. And print line A2, A2 is 1. And if my array was of size 100, I would copy and paste this 100 times. But when I look at this code and I see that the only thing that's altering is this number here, that tells me that I have a loop. And I'm not sure what's going to go in it yet, but what am I doing over and over again? System.out.println a something. And it's the thing that goes in the square brackets that's being done over and over again. And it's starting at 0, going up in ones, ending at 2. So if this is K, I just put a K instead of an I, only because sometimes I's don't show up too well on the screen. K's look better. That's the only reason. So K has to start out at 0. It's going to go up 2 and including 2, and it's going to go up in ones, one at a time. So there is my loop that does this. Suppose I wanted to do it backwards. Supposing I wanted to print this in reverse. I wanted to print out 1 and then 5 and then 0 and then 4. I'll try and copy this. Then if I start at 2 and I go down, till it's greater than or equal to 0, and I'm going down, so instead of plus plus, it's minus minus, then now I'm printing out a 2, and then a 1, and then a 0. So this is printing in reverse. And this is printing. Then we'll go to NetBeans. And here I have a program that, I'll do it here, that 100 times gets a random number between 0 and 9. This is how you get a random number between 0 and 9. And then counts how many there are. If the number was a 0, I'm going to increment num0, and num0, in fact, all of these start out at 0. So I'm going to increment num0. If it was a 5, I'm going to increment num5. So I can do this very nicely with a switch statement. I'm not using arrays at all in this example. And then I want to print them out. There is my 10 print lines. So I'm going to print out the values of num0 through num9. Having mouse problems today. Okay, let's see how, let's see if I can move my mouse. There we go. Let's see how an array is going to help us. Well, now we don't have to declare our 10 variables because we're going to store everything in an array. So have my array of size 10 here. Got my 10, and don't forget it goes from 0 through 9, and this is called num. So num0 through num9, and Java by default puts zeros in here when I create an array. So all of these, I'm not going to write 0 in every, well, maybe I will. My mouse is not a happy camper today. All right, so I've got my num array set up, zeros all over the place. Here are the indices, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, and 9. And let's go back to our code. So I set up my array, and then 100 times I get a random number, and then I look at that number. And let's imagine the number was a 2. Then I increment whatever I find in num2. So if I go over here, it was a 2, so I increment that, that number becomes 1. That's the end of my switch statement, which is also the end of my loop. Get another number, look at it. Let's imagine it was another 2. So increment to num2 again. So num2 then gets incremented one more time. So you can see how this works. So instead of individual variables, I've got an array, and I just increment the appropriate elements in the array. When I print it out, look at my print line here. The total number of something is this. I don't expect you, let me see if I can copy this into my Sketchpad. I don't expect you to be able to just see that loop. So you would write this, and then you would do the same or very similar on the next line. And you would keep on going. You would do 9 of them, 10 of them all together. The last one would be num9. And then you would say, gee, I've just done the same thing over and over and over again. So that leads me to a loop. What is it that's changing? It is this number here in the square brackets, and it is this number that comes before the 0. So the things that are changing are the things that you use your loop variable for, in this case I. So you put the I in here, and then you have to just break this up a little bit, so you've got the I coming right before the S, and then you stick it in your loop. So build, keep on writing, note that these are very similar. Once you start doing copy and paste, then you know that's the signal to you that you're doing the same thing over and over again. So then think about loop. What is it that's changing? And the thing that's changing is the thing where you put your loop variable in, and then figure out, okay, it goes from 0 to 9, so less than 10, and then this number here is changing, so break my string up so that I can get that changing number in there. So don't worry if you can't immediately see a loop. Don't think, oh gee, you know, everybody else can see a loop but I can't, and that's not true. Just keep doing, keep printing code, and once you see that you're repeating code, ding, 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 alarm should go off in your head. That's a loop. So I had an even better solution here, because look how much I have been able to shorten my code. Although shorter code is not always better code, but in this case it is. Got my array here. I called it total. I called it by a different name just so that I could initialize it again for you. Here's my random numbers being generated just as before, but now I don't have a switch statement. Last time I had a switch statement here. I had a switch statement. Now this does the same as a switch statement, but it just does it in one line. So I'm getting a random number. Whatever that number is, that's the index of my array that needs to be incremented. And that's actually what I'm saying here. Whatever that number is, that's the index of the array and that needs to be incremented. So I'm able to do it here without ifs. This is a little bit more sophisticated. If this is not what you see immediately, that's okay. For those of you that's had a little bit more programming practice, you should be able to do this. And then this is as before. With this program, we demonstrate a few other features of arrays. And because I'm going to use a random number generator, the first thing I want to do is make sure that I know how to generate a random number. I'm just going to comment out the other parts of my code I don't need here. And NetBeans actually does something really nifty for us. You'll see I've selected some code here. And if I go up to this top toolbar and I choose the second icon from the right and click on that, it will comment out that block of code for me. So what I've done so far then is generate a random number. Let's run that. Make sure that we can generate a number. Okay, fine. If we want to uncomment, which I want to uncomment this, I go up to this toolbar and it's the one on the right to uncomment. Except I wanted that to be a comment. Okay. So here is a different way to declare and initialize an array. We've declared an array of ints and then curly braces here, integers separated by commas, and now I have created an array and I put 14, -6, 73 and 14 in that array. And let's just print it out to make sure that that's what we did. So I'll uncomment the rest of this and run it. And here we see that our array was, and I've got the correct numbers in there, so far so good. So again, another way of initializing an array. You do not have to say what size it is. You just have to use the curly braces and it's whatever size, however many things you put in there. And one thing I didn't say before was that an array has to have elements of the same type. So it can't have an int, a double, a string, something like that. It has to be all ints, all doubles, all strings, all characters, all the same type. And the reason is that when the machine needs to make enough room for this array, it needs to know how many bytes to reserve for this array. So if it's an array of length 4 and they're characters, that's just 4 bytes. But if it's an array of length 4 and they are integers and we have 4 bytes for an integer, then that's 16 bytes that needs to be reserved. So they all have to be the same type. Well, here is another way of declaring an array and putting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 random numbers in it. So you remember up on line 12 here, we practiced generating a random number. So here we are generating 5 random numbers and putting them into the array. And I did this here to show you that it can be done. You may want to use this in your next homework. And the for loop, we're going to print out our array. And I want to note here that an array has length, just like a string has length. But when you use the length method with a string, you say string name dot length and you put parentheses after it. With an array, you do not. How do you remember? Well, one of the easy ways with NetBeans is that when you have written the name of your array and then you hit the dot, it will give you some things that you could use, and one of them is length. So you just click on length and you're all done. So now I'm going to print out my array. So here is our original number, 0. This was our first array, and this was our second array of length 5 that we declared here on line 25 when we generated our random numbers as we created our array.